Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to do a deep dive into all 8 Hyrox stations. I'm going to show you what good technique looks like, where most people go wrong, and cues you can use to sharpen your performance. Whether you're preparing for your first Hyrox or trying to shave minutes off your next, this is a video for you. So as a reminder, these are the 8 Hyrox stations. First up is the 1000 meters ski erg. With the ski erg, we need to be focusing on a full body movement. We want to engage the core, legs and hips and not just the arms. Good practice is to keep a slight bend in the knee, hinge at the hips and imagine trying to throw your chest to the ground. We want to keep our core engaged the whole time. The power should come from the legs and the core, and the arms should act as the last link in the chain. On the ski, I personally aim for between 30 to 40 strokes per minute. A common mistake that I see a lot of athletes making is pulling with their arms only. This is just going to fatigue our arms and our shoulders early on in the race, when we have a lot more to use them for later on. We can generate a lot more power through our legs and our core, so it makes sense to use these muscle groups. Another mistake is jerky, inconsistent movement. This just causes our heart rate to undulate, spiking and then dropping, and is basically just going to cost us more energy. Moving on then to the 50 meter sled push. With the sled push, we want to imagine trying to create as much horizontal force as possible. We want to get nice and low and imagine trying to drive through the sled. We want to keep our rib cage and our pelvis in a nice stacked position, take little kicks against the floor and keep the sled moving for as long as possible. Having our hands too high up on the sled is going to cause too much vertical force, which is ultimately just wasted energy. It's better to take short, powerful steps, aiming to kick the floor away, rather than taking these long over strides. Rhythm and tempo are key here. A mistake I see a lot of people making is extending their arms on the sled. This is basically like trying to do an overhead squat compared to a back squat. I can probably imagine you can lift a lot heavier on a back squat than you can on an overhead squat. Same thing with the sled push. You can generate a lot more force by going over the sled nice and low, trying to get as much of our body weight over the sled, as opposed to having our arms out in front and taking all the weight in our shoulders. Another mistake I see people making is simply doing it too fast. Trying to get it overdone with as quick as possible, it's just going to create a ton of fatigue. It's going to be really hard to disperse that lactic acid on the next run. It makes sense to pace ourselves, break the track up into smaller segments. I personally break it up in half, take a little bit of a rest and go again. Next up is the 50 meter sled pull. We want to look at the sled pull as a deadlift motion. Firstly, we want to get the slack out of the rope, so we've got a nice firm tension out in front. Then we want to imagine trying to deadlift the rope off the ground in order to get the sled moving. Once it's moving, we then want to use that momentum to take a few steps back. Go as far back in your box as possible so that you can maximize the space available to you. We're going to be trying to generate as much power as possible through the glutes and the hamstrings. Again, these are the biggest muscle groups and therefore can generate the most power. A common mistake I see a lot of people making here is just using their arms. Although you might be able to move the sled faster with just your arms, it's just going to cost you a lot more energy in the long run. That's why if you're doing a solos race, I would definitely go with a deadlift and walk back motion. If you're doing a doubles, perhaps you could just use your arms. Another mistake I see a lot of people making is not walking as far back as they can. We want to reduce the amount of reps that we have to do, as that will save us energy in the long run. So really try and maximize the space in your box, kick the rope out so you can walk as far back as possible. I personally am a fan of laying the rope in between my feet and go with a bit of a wider stance. This means I can just maximize the amount of space available to me. Let's move on to the 80 meter burpee broad jump. This is usually the station people hate the most, but there are ways we can make it easier for ourselves. Firstly, when we jump and land, we want to kick our legs back as soon as possible and just simply drop onto the floor. If you land and stand back up and then go back to the ground, you're ultimately just going to cost more energy because you're then standing up and then having to go down to the ground. Whereas we can try and use as much momentum as possible, it's going to save us a lot more energy in the long run. If you're going to rest here, do it lying on the floor, not standing up. Trust me, it's the only time in the race you'll be able to sit or lie on the floor, so make the most of it. Another cue I like to recommend is rather than jumping up to your feet, taking a step up or even kneeling up. This is just going to create a nice smooth tempo and rhythm to the entire station. That means we can just get into a nice decent pace that keeps our heart rate steady and actually can get some recovery in off the back of the heavy sleds. A mistake I sometimes see people making is actually jumping too high up in the air as opposed to across the ground. Remember, we're trying to move horizontally, not vertically. Stay nice and low when you jump, land, drop your body to the ground as quick as possible, take a second, step up to your feet as far as you possibly can, jump again, rinse and repeat for 80 meters. After the burpees, we've got 1,000 meters on the rower. Now, this is our only opportunity to sit down in a race. The correct stroke sequence is to drive with the legs first, then pull with the arms, and then go back together. We want to keep our back straight and our core engaged the whole time. We want to try and keep this station as smooth as possible, with a nice consistent flow of reps, as opposed to going in, hitting it as hard as possible and then having to recover for the remainder of the 1,000 meters. I personally aim for about 25 to 30 strokes per minute. We want to keep a nice, strong, powerful motion as we try and pull the handle back and then take our time as we reach forward to recover. A common mistake I see a lot of people making is pulling with the arms first. This means that the legs are underutilized and the arms are overworked. And another thing is not actually maximizing the range of motion available on the rower. We want to try and get as much distance per rep as possible here. So pulling with your arms too early and not going as far back as you can with the handle just means you're going to have to perform more reps and therefore more energy. Then we've got the 200 meter farmer's carry. Just a few cues on this one. Stand tall, keep your chest up, your core engaged, and actually keep your ribcage pulled down. We want to try and hold the kettlebells as still as possible down by our side. Swinging them is just going to create suboptimal inertia, which is basically just going to cost us more energy. Remember, efficiency is the name of the game here. And I'd always recommend walking with a purpose. Try and get a nice steady pace on, but not running. I personally keep my head down the whole time, look at my feet, and just imagine trying to kick the floor away, waiting for it to be over. A big mistake I see a lot of people making is slouching too much with the kettlebells. This just puts so much strain on the upper back muscles before they've been used later in the race, and might actually mean that we end up dropping the kettlebells, costing us more time on the station. Another mistake would be overstriding or taking too small steps. This just causes inefficiency and fatigue. We want to get into a nice steady pace and a decent cadence. Then we're on to the 100 meter sandbag lunges. The key for this is to keep the torso upright and try not to lean too far forward. Make sure you're keeping your chest up. We want to take big enough steps so we can cover as much ground as possible per rep, but make sure that we're not overstriding to cause a stretch on our muscles, because that is going to create a lot of fatigue going into the last station of the race. And I'd always recommend taking a little step in between each lunge. This is just going to provide you a micro dose of recovery between each rep and prevent fatigue levels from accumulating too quickly. A common mistake I see a lot of athletes making is shaking and moving too far to the left or the right. I can understand that your muscles are probably tired at this point, but we want to try and keep the movement as efficient as possible. That means focusing all our energy moving forward and trying to engage the abductors and adductors to keep us in a nice steady pace. Try not to let the hips and knees rotate as we move through the station. That brings us to the last station of the race, 100 wall balls. With this, good form is imperative. We need to make sure that we are getting our hips below our knees with each rep. A good way to do this is actually to practice holding the wall ball out in front of you. By holding something out in front, we can keep our rib cage and our pelvis stacked, moving up and down like in an elevator. This is also going to help us balance our weight in the back of our heels and help us get as low as possible so we don't get any no reps. On the wall balls, I like to recommend a controlled descent in the squat and an explosive drive up through the shoulders. Most people will say it is their shoulders that fatigue first before their legs. It makes sense then to take our time on the squat on the way down to give our shoulders a little bit of a rest, and then explode on the way up using as much power as possible to make sure that we hit the target. We need to make sure we're keeping the core tight and have a steady breathing rate throughout. A common mistake I see people making is using too much shoulders on the way up. We want to make it all one nice powerful movement, straight from the legs to the shoulders and up, as opposed to standing up and then trying to throw it just with our shoulders. Trust me, we'll be able to generate a lot more power getting our legs involved than simply using our shoulders. And another mistake I see people making is trying to do a load of reps as quickly as possible, burning out and then having to rest for longer. It makes sense in training to figure out how many reps we're going to do in a row before breaking and just get into a nice steady flow of them, maintaining our breathing throughout and not trying to rush through it and causing undue fatigue. Remember, this is the last station of the race. We need to make sure we can go through the whole time and not burn out too quickly. All right, there we go. Those are the 8 stations of Hyrox and how I'd recommend performing. Just a little note to finish on. What you need to do in training is to figure out what works best for you with each station. Everyone will have a different technique and approach that works for them on each station. Your job is not to necessarily copy someone else's, but to find what works best for you. It's very common when you watch a Hyrox race to see a load of different techniques. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong way to do it. There are just cues that most people will follow in order to keep the movement as efficient as possible and energy conserving. If you like this video, please subscribe, and if you've got anything you want me to cover in future videos, please drop them in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.